What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Are they a scheming social climber or a real-life Cinderella? The story behind Louis XIV's secret wife. The Sun King's first impression of the governess of his children was that she was a strict prude. He eventually wed her. A late-night marriage ceremony took place at the Palace of Versailles in the fall of 1683 in a chapel lit by candles. The groom was Louis XIV, 45, also known as the Sun King, the French monarch. The Marquise de Maintenon, 48, a woman of humble origins who had previously worked as his children's governess, was his bride. Only the king's confessor and the Archbishop of Paris were present at the clandestine nuptials, and the marriage was never officially registered. Madame de Maintenon rose to the position of uncrowned Queen of France without the knowledge of the court of Versailles or the rest of the world. The Marquise de Maintenon is one of the most enigmatic and divisive figures from France's ancien regime. She has been portrayed as anything from a warm, conniving social climber to a generous, real-life Cinderella. Whether you like her or not, the extraordinary tale of her rise from poverty to wealth does appear to have been taken straight out of a fairy tale. Françoise d'Aubagne, as she was previously referred to, was born in a prison in Niort, western France, in 1635, where her father Constant was incarcerated for a variety of offenses. She was the result of a union between the incarcerated man and the prison governor's much younger daughter. Françoise's grandfather, Agrippa d'Aubagne, was a well-known poet and well-liked minor nobility member. However, the younger d'Aubagne did not follow in his father's footsteps and instead spent his entire life drinking, gambling, and conniving his way through France. Indeed, Agrippa d'Aubagne was so disappointed with his wretch of a son that he disinherited him, unwittingly leaving Constance's young wife and kids to their father's whims, which included a perilous voyage across the Atlantic to the Dutch Antilles in a failed attempt to start a plantation 2 years after his release from prison. Constant then abandoned his family and returned to France, where he died a short time later under ambiguous circumstances. The remaining d'Aubagnes also fled the Caribbean with no money and Constant out of the picture. However, Françoise, who was 12 years old at the time, took to begging for food on the streets of La Rochelle because the family's situation back home was so dire. Instability followed Françoise into her adolescence, during which she briefly lived with a beloved Huguenot aunt and uncle at their estate, and in the home of her godmother's mom, Madame de Maintenon, who promptly shipped her off to an Ursuline convent in the hopes of converting the rebellious teenager to Catholicism. She initially resisted, but she eventually converted to the dominant religion in France, with some assistance from a young nun named Sister Celeste, with whom she developed a close friendship. Françoise was married off to the writer Paul Seurat when de Maintenon refused to pay the fees, and Françoise lost her place in the convent. Seurat, who was more than 20 years older than her and had rheumatoid arthritis that had caused her to be severely deformed, broke down in tears when she first met the 16-year-old. However, Françoise accepted his proposal anyway. The brunette, tall, dark-eyed, and thought to be stunning, was broke, had no parents, and didn't have a dowry. Her only other option was to return to a convent. The union would alter her life's trajectory. What he lacked in looks, Seurat made up for in intelligence, wit, and social savvy. Seurat welcomed a variety of literary luminaries, philosophers, and wealthy aristocrats into his residence as host of a well-known salon libertine in the capital of France. His young bride rose to prominence in the Parisian salon scene quickly. Françoise was highly intelligent in addition to her physical beauty, which earned her the moniker La Belle Indienne due to her tan complexion. She received an education from her time spent with her aunt and uncle and in the convent. She honed her skills even more by interacting with and carefully studying the affluent salon guests. Françoise employed an unconventional strategy for social success after realizing she could not compete with the fashionable and well-to-do women in her group. In a biography of Maintenon, Veronica Buckley writes, unable to perform à la mode, she played instead a tactical counterpoint, dressing with deliberate simplicity and disdaining even the plainer jewelry she might have worn. This calculated image of modesty charmed the nobles, and soon Françoise, now Madame Seurat, developed a slick social acumen that even modern-day business moguls would envy. A talented conversationalist and an astute listener, She built relationships with the writers Racine and La Fontaine, as well as the legendary courtesan Ninon de l'Enclos. In a letter, the aristocrat Madame de Maintenon wrote, "She has an agreeable and marvelously sensible mind." She also called Françoise's company delicious. It was her dazzling social network that came to her aid upon the death of Paul Scarrat, who left his 25-year-old widow with piles of debt. She got a pension from the Queen Mother with the help of her friends, but another high-level salon contact would give her a chance that would raise her status to new heights. Madame Athena's de Maintenon, 29, a member of the high nobility, was King Louis XIV official mistress and required a governess to discreetly raise the illegitimate offspring of the 31-year-old king. Maintenon and the king had 7 children together after Françoise agreed. Louis's impression of the new governess was of an uptight prude, and he wrote her off as unbearable. But his opinion of Françoise softened over the years. Buckley quotes him as saying, "It would be something to be loved by a woman like that." He was also impressed by her intelligence and calm, rational demeanor, which was a refreshing change from the high maintenance of La Maintenon. She lavished love on his children. A close friendship developed in the early 1670s when Françoise was in her late 30s. The bond between the monarch and the governess deepened after she relocated with the children from Paris to the palace at Saint-Germain-en-Laye after Louis, many believe at Françoise's gentle prompting, decided to legitimize his progeny with Maintenon. The two spent more and more time together, often deep in conversation, and Louis showed his appreciation by upping her salary and offering her generous monetary gifts. Louis XIV gave Françoise the title of Marquise de Maintenon after she used the funds to acquire a chateau in the style of the Renaissance in Maintenon. According to historians, the king and Madame de Maintenon began a romantic relationship around 1680. Some people think he was finally ready to get married to someone stable and serious because he was sick of Maintenon and her rants. The pious Maintenon fit the bill. The king's nickname for her was Your Steadiness, and a deep friendship already existed between the two. The middle-aged Louis had also endured illnesses in recent years, and was beginning to feel the weight of his mortality. He was a believing man, Buckley says. He was afraid of dying and going to hell. Indeed, the ruler and the court underwent transformation during this time. To Montespan's dismay, the raucous parties ended and she was officially replaced by her former friend. The insolent womanizer began to treat his long-neglected wife, Queen Maria Theresa, more favorably in her final years at Maintenon's direction. The intimate nighttime wedding between France's king and Maintenon took place several months after the queen's death in 1683. The union was kept secret because of her lower social status, even though many courtiers were suspicious of the truth. A change that historians attribute to the influence of his devoted wife. Louis abandoned his lifelong philandering in favor of a more wholesome existence after the marriage. Despite Louis's love for her, not everyone at the court liked the former commoner whose Versailles apartments were next to the king's. In letters to relatives, the French ruler's sister-in-law, Princess Palatine, hurled insults at his second wife, including old witch, old whore, and mouse-dropping. In contrast, Madame de Maintenon is portrayed by the Duc de Saint-Simon in his memoirs as a dishonest, power-hungry hypocrite. She was very pretty, very smart, and had a natural grace and authority about her. However, Buckley says that she came from nothing and people don't like that. There was a strong attitude of who does she think she is, especially in a situation where rank is everything. Christine Adams, a professor at St. According to a co-author of a book on French royal mistresses and professor at Mary's College of Maryland, 19th-century historians also unfairly vilified Maintenon, blaming her, for example, for the king's decision to revoke the Edict of Nantes, which caused the Huguenots of the country to be subjected to new forms of oppression and violence. She acknowledges that, like the majority of members of the court of Versailles, the uncrowned queen had a ruthless side, and she says that her history is very divided. I think we have all been influenced by this sort of black legend about her. Historians continue to disagree about Maintenon's political influence at the court. According to Jean Cordelier's 1955 biography, Louis XIV wanted Madame de Maintenon in his bed, not in his government. However, many contemporary scholars disagree, asserting that she was a key player in the Sun King's administration. Mark Bryant argues in his book Queen of Versailles, Madame de Maintenon, First Lady of Louis XIV France, that Maintenon's influence at Versailles rivaled that of ministers at one point. This is especially true during the War of the Spanish Succession, when in addition to participating in conciliatory discussions, she also received and named ambassadors and assisted in modifying government policies. She clearly had a lot of power as a political advisor because, according to Adams, their councils met in her room. Someone with political power is the most effective means of gaining the king's favor. However, the boarding school that Maintenon established outside of Versailles in Saint-Cyr is thought to have piqued her interest the most. Students at the Maison Royale de St. Louis were affluent girls who had come from noble families like hers and were given an elite education and dowries. The elderly Maintenon moved into the school after Louis XIV's death in 1715, where she continued to receive notable visitors, including Peter the Great. She died 4 years after the king at the age of 83 and was buried in the school's chapel. The stunning flower gardens that surround the Château de Maintenon were originally designed by André Le Notre, the renowned landscape architect responsible for the gardens at the Palace of Versailles. They can be reached in less than an hour by train from Paris. Every spring, approximately 15,000 tulips bloom, and throughout the entire year, visitors can take a tour of the interior and admire various personal items, such as a library filled with her favorite books. The large oil painting of the late Marquise by Pierre Mignard is also on display in the chateau. It shows a middle-aged woman in a dress made of gold brocade and a cape made of royal blue. She appears to be contemplatively gazing at the audience while holding an open book in her left hand. Madame de Maintenon burned thousands of her personal letters before she died, most of which were written to Louis XIV. A fire at the Louvre in the latter part of the 19th century resulted in the loss of additional letters. "My life has been extraordinary," she reportedly said to a friend in her later years. However, France's complicated secret queen remains, above all else, a mystery more than 300 years after her death due to the destruction of her most intimate writings. The story of Françoise d'Aubagne, who rose to become the Marquise de Maintenon and eventually married Louis XIV, the Sun King, is a historical narrative that transcends biography to become a foundational myth of the French monarchy. It is a story that historians debate endlessly, trying to reconcile the image of a scheming, calculated social climber with that of a pious, devoted, almost Cinderella-like figure who captured her journey from a birth in prison to a clandestine wedding in the candlelit chapel of Versailles represents one of the most extraordinary social ascents in history, a trajectory that forces us to examine the very nature of power, influence, piety, and love in the crucible of the Ancien Regime. To view her only as a pious Cinderella is to overlook the razor-sharp social acumen and calculated self-fashioning that were essential to her survival and rise. To label her simply as an ambitious climber is to ignore the desperate circumstances of her youth, as well as the profound intellectual and spiritual depth she cultivated. The truth about Madame de Maintenon is that she was both an excellent strategist and a truly devoted partner. Her greatest accomplishment was not to seduce a king, but to become his indispensable confidant, the uncrowned queen of his twilight years, and the steadying influence on a realm that was beginning to show the first signs of the revolution that would eventually consume it. The origins of this future royal consort could not have been more inauspicious, seemingly precluding any possibility of grandeur. Françoise d'Aubagne was born in a prison in Niort, western France, in 1635. She entered the world as a symbol of her family's shame. Her father, Constant d'Aubagne, was incarcerated for a litany of crimes including murder, adultery and fraud, a profound disappointment to his own father, Agrippa d'Aubagne, a celebrated Protestant poet, soldier and minor nobleman. Agrippa's disinheritance of his profligate son unwittingly condemned Constance's young wife, Jeanne de Cartelhac, and their children to a life of penury and instability. Constance's release from prison did not bring salvation but further recklessness. He dragged his family on a perilous voyage to the Dutch Antilles in a futile attempt to establish a plantation, only to abandon them there and return to France, where he soon died under mysterious circumstances. The family managed a desperate return to France, where their situation remained dire, after finding themselves stranded in the Caribbean without any resources. At the tender age of 12, Françoise was forced to beg for food on the streets of La Rochelle. This shocking and humiliating low point would forever cement in her mind the precariousness of life and the absolute necessity of safety. She moved between homes during her adolescence, which exposed her to the stark religious and social divides of France. This instability characterized her adolescence. She found brief refuge with a beloved aunt and uncle, who were devout Huguenots, French Protestants, and it was within this pious Protestant environment that her early religious sensibilities were formed. This haven lasted only a short time. Madame de Maintenon, the godmother's mother, was horrified by the girl's Protestant upbringing and quickly placed her in her care. Determined to correct this heresy, de Maintenon promptly shipped Françoise off to an Ursuline convent with the explicit goal of converting her. The teen initially resisted, clinging to her family's faith. However, with the patient and gentle guidance of a young nun named Sister Celeste, she underwent a profound spiritual conversion to Catholicism. She had truly undergone a transformation that would form the foundation of her identity for the rest of her life, not a cynical calculation. However, when Madame de Maintenon refused to continue paying the convent fees, Françoise faced a devastating crossroads: a return to the oppressive household of her benefactress or an uncertain future. Her first major escape was planned at this juncture, but it was expensive for her personally. The escape took the form of a marriage proposal from Paul Seurat, a celebrated Parisian writer and poet 25 years her senior. Seurat was a tragic figure whose body was cruelly twisted and immobile due to severe rheumatoid arthritis. He was frequently compared to a disgusting human pretzel. He reportedly broke down in tears upon first meeting the 16-year-old Françoise, overwhelmed by her youth and beauty in contrast to his own malformation. The choice was brutal but clear for the tall, dark-eyed, strikingly beautiful Françoise. Marriage to this ailing, kind, and famous man or a life of poverty, probably in a convent. She chose the first option. Despite the unconventional manner in which it began, this union proved to be her entry point into a new world. Seurat made up for his lack of physical strength by having a brilliant, witty, and generous mind. He was the host of a well-known libertine salon in Paris, which was a lively intellectual hub that attracted some of the most influential writers, philosophers, and free-thinking aristocrats in the city. The young Madame Seurat received a second education that was significantly more worldly than her education in a convent when she was thrust into this role as the mistress of a well-known salon. She was not merely a decorative hostess. She was a keen observer and an avid participant. She was aware that she would not be able to compete with the opulently dressed, born aristocratic women who went to the salon. According to her biographer Veronica Buckley, she adopted a tactical counterpoint instead, cultivating an image of deliberate simplicity and modest dress, even if she could have worn plain jewelry. Her brand was based on her calculated modesty, which was a refreshing and intriguing contrast to the court's extravagantness. She improved her conversational skills and, more importantly, her ability to listen. She established a substantial circle of influential acquaintances, which included the playwrights Jean Racine and Molière, the fabulous Jean de La Fontaine, and the renowned courtesan Ninon de L'Enclos. The famed letter-writer Madame de Sévigné captured the emerging consensus, describing Françoise as having an agreeable and marvelously sensible mind, and calling her company delicious. During this time, she developed the essential skills she would use at Versailles, including social intelligence, psychological insight, and alliance-building ability. Paul Seurat left his 25-year-old widow with debt rather than wealth when he died in 1660. Françoise faced poverty once more. However, the social capital that she had so skillfully developed is now beginning to pay off. She was rescued from the convent by her powerful friends, who successfully lobbied the Queen Mother and of Austria to provide her with a modest pension. However, it was her friendship with the vibrant and ambitious Madame de Maintenon, the king's official mistress, maîtresse en titre, a second connection from her salon days that would change her life forever. By the late 1660s, Louis XIV and Maintenon were deeply involved in a passionate affair that had produced several illegitimate children. The children's existence was kept a carefully guarded secret, and only a trustworthy governess could care for them away from the court's prying eyes. Montespan recommended Françoise for the position because he was aware of her intelligence, discretion, and precarious financial situation. Louis XIV had a very negative first impression of the new governess. She was stern, overly religious, and unbearable to him, a prude who didn't fit in with his glittering libertine court. For her part, Françoise initially feared the Sun King. Yet over time his opinion underwent a radical transformation. He witnessed her not only educating his children with rigor, but also lavishing them with genuine affection and care. Contrasting sharply with the tumultuous, demanding, and increasingly volatile Montespan, she demonstrated immense capability, calm logic, and unwavering devotion. The king began looking for a different kind of companionship as he approached middle age and became exhausted by the dramas of his mistress. He found himself drawn to Françoise's steady presence, her intelligent conversation, and her profound piety. A deep friendship blossomed between the monarch and the governess in the early 1670s. Françoise moved in with Louis and his children to a house near the palace in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, placing her permanently within the royal circle. Many believe at Françoise's gentle prompting. Their bond deepened through long hours of conversation. Louis, a king who was always performing for his court, found Françoise to be a woman with whom he could just talk about statecraft, religion, and his own anxieties and goals. He showed his appreciation not with romantic overtures, but with tangible signs of favor, increasing her salary and offering generous monetary gifts. It was with this money that Françoise made a brilliant investment, purchasing the Château de Maintenon, a beautiful Renaissance estate. In 1674, the king formally elevated her status, granting her the title of Marquise de Maintenon. She was no longer the widowed governess. Rather, she was a distinct noblewoman. Although the precise nature of their subsequent relationship is still the subject of historical debate, it was almost certainly romantic by around 1680. The king, now in his 40s, was growing weary of the exhausting passions of his youth.